Welcome to Sleep Thrum. To all of you who have come here tonight, from the lantern-lit streets of Marrakesh, the misty hills of Chiapas, the windswept plains of Mongolia, the ancient alleyways of Granada, and the quiet villages tucked along the Danube. We are truly glad you're here. Wherever you rest your head tonight, may this story accompany you like a gentle road through memory. A path you may not remember walking, but one your heart never forgot. So let the world dim around you. Let the noise of the day soften beneath the rhythm of falling rain. You are safe here, and the story is ready to begin. This is The Path That Vanished from the Maps. Part 1. The Rain That Fell on Forgotten Stones. There is a kind of rain that no longer speaks the language of urgency. It doesn't rush from cloud to ground, nor pound rooftops like war drums. It simply lingers, quietly descending like a memory that refuses to leave. In the far reaches of a countryside that modernity forgot, somewhere between the vanished woods of Lorraine and the broken stones of East Prussia, there lies a path that no longer appears on any map. It is not hidden. It is simply forgotten. Those who still remember it do so without knowing. In their dreams, they walk it, though they cannot tell you where it begins or ends. And those who walk it by accident find themselves pausing often, unsure whether they are still moving forward or merely circling some invisible center. This path is older than the roads paved by kings, and more enduring than the ambitions of those who tried to erase it. It exists in a realm between mud and myth, where history softens into folklore, and folklore sighs into sleep. Its story does not begin with a war, nor with a love, but with an old man who no longer believed he had anything left to say. He lived in a cottage made of half timber and stone, moss blooming between the wood, as if time itself had been kind enough to let the house grow old, gently. His name was Etienne. His voice, when he still used it, was the kind of voice that made birds pause mid-song and cats lift their heads mid-dream. He had once taught history at a lycée in the capital, but that was a lifetime ago. Or perhaps two. Each morning, as if answering a summons only he could hear, Etienne would wrap himself in a wool coat frayed at the cuffs, take his walking stick, and follow the sound of rain until it led him to the path. He would walk slowly, not because of age, though age had indeed taken his knees, but because the path demanded silence. There were no carriages, no bicycles, no boots of modern manufacture upon this trail. Only the hush of wet leaves underfoot and the occasional breath of mist slipping through hedgerows. The rain always returned when he walked the path, even if the sky had promised sunlight just minutes before. Not a storm, never thunder, just that quiet, persistent drizzle, the kind that made the trees lean inward as if listening. Etienne never spoke to anyone about the path, not because it was a secret, but because some things lose their truth when told too soon. He believed the path would reveal its meaning only to those patient enough to listen, not with ears, but with time. And so he walked, and the rain walked with him. Villagers from the nearby hamlet, though few remained, often wondered where the old man disappeared to each morning. They had long stopped asking, not out of disinterest, but out of reverence. There was something sacred about his routine, as if, by walking that path, he was doing penance, not just for himself, but for history itself. One morning, the baker, whose oven was older than most trees in the village, claimed he saw Etienne walking with someone, a boy perhaps, or a memory. The baker was unsure. What he did remember was that the path, once faint and narrow, had looked clearer that morning, as if grateful for being remembered. And so begins our story, not with thunder or proclamation, but with the whisper of wet footsteps on forgotten stones. Part 2. The boy who walked through rain. No one in the village recalled seeing a child arrive. No wagons had passed. No trains had stopped. No strangers had appeared at the inn with weathered luggage and unfamiliar eyes. And yet, by the time the second week of October had folded into mist, the boy was simply there. He was not of the village. His boots were stitched differently, finer than what cobblers here fashioned. His eyes bore the same tired blue as the northern sea, soft, searching, and somehow old. He spoke little, but when he did, he chose words like a poet, precise, gentle, and rare. Some said he had followed the rain. He did not speak his name. Etienne never asked for it. It seemed unimportant between them. The old man would nod at the boy each morning, and the boy would fall into step beside him, their silence weaving something sturdier than speech. There was no explanation offered, and none needed. The villagers stopped wondering. The baker began baking an extra roll each day, and the widow near the well left a scarf on her gate in case the boy might need it. They became familiar only as shapes. The tall, hunched silhouette of the old man and the slight, straight-backed form of the boy, disappearing each morning into the folds of mist. What did they speak of if they spoke at all? Perhaps not words, but the sound of shoes sinking slightly into wet earth, the passing of a crow above a clearing, the pause to observe a tree that had fallen in the night. Etienne noticed things he had never noticed before since the boy arrived. A hollow beneath a stone that echoed like a bell when rain filled it. Moss that curled like a forgotten letter. A stone that bore markings he thought had faded forever. The boy would linger behind at times, tracing the path with his fingers as if reading something written in the mud. Etienne never hurried him. Time, like the path, had softened around them. One morning, as the clouds parted just slightly and a shard of sunlight pressed its way through the branches, Etienne saw the boy smile, not with joy, but with recognition, as though he'd reached a place he had once left behind. That was the morning the old man knew. The boy had not come to find the path. He had come to remember it. Part 3. The blacksmith who waited by the milestone. The village of Corlane had no smithy for a long time. Not until the winter when the iron in their plows grew brittle and the hinges of doors groaned like old men in pain. Then came Anselm, the blacksmith who said little, smoked pipeweed from the eastern ports, and built his forge near the 6th milestone, a moss-eaten marker along the road that no longer appeared on the maps. He did not speak of his past, nor did anyone ask. Some said he had once forged swords for a noble war in a country whose name was now lost to border shifts. Others believed he had simply wandered too far north and forgot how to turn back. Anselm lived alone, save for a black cat that kept close to the heat of the forge. The cat had only one eye, and people whispered that it had once belonged to a witch. Rumors are cheaper than bread in places like Corlane. He arrived during a storm, dragging with him a wheeled anvil cart and a bellows wrapped in waxed cloth. He slept beneath a tarp for 3 days until a family offered him their empty goat shed. Within a week, he turned the shed into a place of sparks and ringing metal, and people began bringing him broken knives and rusted scythes. But he rarely took coin. Sometimes he asked for bread, or old books, or candles. Sometimes he asked for nothing at all. But every month, always on the 13th, he stood by the milestone after midnight and waited. The villagers spoke of it, of course. Whispers and wine always mixed well on cold evenings. Some thought he waited for a woman who would never come, a lover lost in one of the old wars. Others believed he was meeting a ghost, or that he paid tribute to some forgotten saint of travelers. But no one ever saw anything. No horse, no coach, no visitor. Just Anselm, standing still in the rain, sometimes holding a bundle wrapped in canvas. Elders said that milestone was once a rest stop on a royal road that connected the Abbey of Luxfall to the fortress city of Gildern. The road had been cut off during the Great Swelling, when floods reshaped the land and cartographers simply stopped drawing that part of the kingdom. But peasants remembered it. Their parents had walked it, and their children still dreamed of paths that curved behind mossy boulders and vanished into blackberry thickets. When asked why he chose that spot for his forge, Anselm only said, "I don't make tools for maps." In the 3rd year of his quiet residence, the road beneath the milestone began to glow. Not brightly, faint, like wet ash under moonlight. Only those who passed it at night on their way back from the western fields could see it, and even then, only if they were not looking directly. It was something you saw from the corner of your eye, a line of damp stones, smooth and clean, veering off into the hills. And if you turned your head to look, it was gone again. Children began whispering about it in the orchard. One girl claimed she followed the light and saw a procession of monks walking barefoot across the hills, each holding a candle made of frost. Another said she saw her dead grandfather walking beside Anselm. She was punished for lying, but her story lingered, like the smell of burnt time on a damp tunic. Anselm never confirmed or denied anything, but one night, a boy named Toban, who worked as a stable hand, followed him. He told no one, not even his sister, who always watched the milestone from her bedroom window. Toban crouched in the hedges, covered in wet leaves, heart pounding like hoofbeats. At midnight, Anselm came. He placed a rusted key on the milestone. A few raindrops hit the stone and steamed off. Then he whispered something, inaudible to Toban, and walked away. The path behind him glowed briefly, and for a moment, Toban swore. He saw footsteps appear in the mud without anyone making them. No one saw Toban after that. His boots were found near the forge, and the cat, once always seen by the hearth, had vanished too. Anselm said nothing. He closed the forge for a week, then opened it again. The hammer rang as before, but the next 13th, he did not go to the milestone. He stared at it from afar, eyes narrow, like a man who saw a door but forgot why he had ever walked through it. That winter the road glowed brighter, and more villagers began to forget how the hill path once curved toward the east orchard. It was as though the landscape shifted quietly, without their permission, until the only road they knew was the one the maps drew. But the peasants remembered. They always did. And they whispered, "There is a road that only exists when someone truly needs it." Anselm, the blacksmith, never left Corlane, But those who visited his forge late in the night claimed that the sound of his hammer no longer echoed off the stones, but instead traveled far, far away, as if ringing on a heel no longer in this world. Part 4. The Candlemaker's Widow. Rain fell softly that evening, painting the cobbled streets in amber reflections. The town square, once full of merchants and gossip, had become a pool of silence under the slow twilight. It was here that the candlemaker's widow lived. In a narrow brick house, tucked between the shoemaker's forgotten workshop and a tavern whose door never closed in summer. Her name was Magda. They said she could hear wax harden. Her fingers, still nimble though aged, shaped every wick like a prayer. But Magda was no longer making candles to sell. She hadn't been to the market in 3 winters. She crafted only for remembrance. Each candle held the name of someone who had vanished. A brother lost to war. A daughter who never returned from crossing the stream. A cartographer who followed the path that vanished and did not come back. She kept them on her shelves. Hundreds of candles, unburnt. Only one was ever lit each night. A young man named Fen came to her door one evening, soaked to the bone. He carried with him a bundle wrapped in oilskin and the same air of exhaustion the town wore since the road began to disappear. "I heard you keep memories," he said simply. She looked at him through the slit of the door. "I only light what has been forgotten." Fen handed her the bundle. Inside was a faded map and a key with no teeth. "It was in my uncle's attic. He died last month. They say he walked the path every solstice." Magda let him in. The fire was already burning. For hours they spoke, not of names but of silence, of what absence does to a lineage, of how time doesn't bury things, but misplaces them. She told him stories she hadn't told in years, about the night the town bells rang for no reason, about the woman who woke up one morning and could no longer speak any known language, about the monk who wrote an entire gospel in invisible ink. That night, Magda lit a candle for the first time in months. It was shaped like a compass. As the wick curled into flame, Fen dreamed not of roads, but of rooms, each one filled with a different version of himself, all standing still. He awoke before dawn, the fire nearly dead. Magda was asleep in her chair, a soft smile beneath her breath. Outside, the rain had stopped, but puddles shimmered like pools of memory. He left the map with her, not because he no longer needed it, but because it felt like it belonged among the candles. The next morning, a boy in town said he saw a faint glow from Magda's chimney that danced like a lantern in the fog. Others said nothing. The silence was typical now. But a day later, an old signpost outside town, long rusted and blank, was found to have a word carved into it. Just one: begin. Part 5. The name beneath the signpost. It was just after dawn when Marta, the apothecary's apprentice, first noticed the new carving. She had been sent to gather herbs beyond the hill: rosemary, nettle, and sleep leaf, though few still used the last. As she passed the old signpost on the edge of the road, she stopped, turned back, and ran her fingers across the letters. They were shallow but fresh. The word was not there the day before. She was sure of it. Begin. The wood, old and grey with lichen, now bore a word that did not feel made by knife or nail. but rather like it had always been waiting beneath the surface, finally revealed. She told no one, not yet. Instead, Marta returned before nightfall with a piece of chalk and marked beneath it the outline of a circle, half sun, half moon, something she had once seen in her grandmother's book of weather omens. Then she waited. By the third day, others began to notice. Children on errands slowed as they passed. The baker's boy tried to scratch the word off with a coin, but nothing happened. The priest stared at it long one evening, then walked home without his usual blessing of the street lamps. And Fen, having returned once again, this time without reason, stood before it just as the sky began to storm. He placed a hand upon the post. Beneath his fingers, the wood seemed warmer than it should have been. Then quietly, the rain began again. And just below the word begin, another line appeared. So faint it could only be seen when the light hit it slantwise through the mist. Names remember where maps cannot. Part 6. The letter beneath the hearth. They found the letter by accident. It was 3 days after Fen had left the candlemaker's house, and the rain hadn't returned. Not in earnest, only in the softest drizzle that hung like mist between rooftops. The town had resumed its habits, those faint gestures of repetition mistaken for life. But in the home of the old millwright, whose grandson had taken to storing crates of dry kindling in the hearth, the letter appeared. Folded once, sealed with wax the color of tarnished gold, it had no name, no address, just a symbol, a tree with one root exposed. The grandson, a boy of 11 named Corin, brought it to the local bookkeeper, who knew more of symbols than stories. The bookkeeper turned it over in his wrinkled hands for a long time, before slicing it open with the edge of a rusted ruler. Inside was a single page, written in a steady, unbroken script. To those who do not ask questions but carry them, there is a house with no door that listens. Beneath its chimney, time pools like dust. You will not find it by seeking. You will find it by waiting in places most men leave. Bring nothing. Remember only M. They all assumed M meant Magda. But the widow had not been seen since the morning after Fen's visit. Her windows were shuttered, chimney cold. A grocer delivering bread knocked twice, then walked away, the loaf left untouched for days. Eventually, a girl from the school was dared by her classmates to peer through the slits. She swore she saw only unlit candles, but nothing else, not even the chair. That same week, Fen was seen walking toward the woods with a satchel and no shoes. He did not take the road. Instead, he followed the places where road used to be. The line of leaning stones beside the stream, the dip in the fence behind the orchard, the patch of gravel that held the smell of cartwheels long vanished. And when those too faded, he listened for where the silence was thickest. He stopped at a thicket where birds no longer sang. His breath formed no cloud, though the air was cold. Beneath the moss was a stone with 3 notches, the same shape as the key without teeth. He sat there waiting for an hour, then 2. It wasn't until evening that he noticed the sky. It had no color, not black, not blue, just absence. A curtain between then and now. And in that moment, he understood. The path that vanished was not a trail, but a decision, a moment that chose to be forgotten by the world. yet remembered by a few. Fen did not walk forward. He simply stood and let the dusk wrap around him like a coat of forgetting. That night, in the town, someone lit a candle and did not know why. And on Magda's street, the tavern's door, which never closed in summer, creaked on its hinges and finally shut. No wind, no hands, only silence as always. Part 7. The orchard with no season. No one remembered planting the orchard. It stood at the edge of the mist belt, beyond where the road used to stretch before it surrendered to moss and forgetfulness. The townspeople rarely spoke of it, save for mutterings at dusk, as though even the memory of fruit was too rich for a time like theirs. It bore no blossoms, no rot, no bees, just trees with limbs like knotted arms, as if reaching not for sun, but for something beneath the soil. Fen walked there after leaving Magda's house, guided not by map nor memory, but by a pull behind the ribs, the kind that compels a man to visit graves that aren't marked. The orchard was silent, but not asleep. Each step he took sank slightly into the moss, as if the earth had grown used to swallowing names. A single tree stood at the center, wider than the rest, its trunk twisted in a spiral that made the bark resemble calligraphy. Beneath it, he found a bench carved from the same wood, and on it, not a person, but a coat. It was hanging as if just removed, dry, recently worn. He reached for it, hesitated, then sat beside it instead. Above, the leaves shifted with a breeze he could not feel on his skin. There was a woman once, the townspeople had said, who lived among the orchard. She wore mourning black for a husband no one had seen. She spoke little, but was known to feed the birds every dawn. And then one day, she too disappeared, not vanished, but simply concluded. And the orchard stayed. On the bench beside Fen was a notebook. Its cover was soft leather, warped by age. Inside were pages of dried ink, each marked with a date and a word. July 9th, remembered. October 2nd, unopened. March 15th, split. But many pages had no words, only the pressed shapes of fallen petals. Fen flipped until he found a blank page. He looked up at the tree again, and he wrote, "Today, Saturday." He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but it was the first word he'd written since leaving the path, since deciding not to return. As he stood, the coat fell to the ground, not with a thud, but with a sigh. It was heavy with rainwater that hadn't fallen. He left it where it lay. By nightfall, the orchard had fog again, and if one stood still enough near its edge, they might hear the faint sound of fruit falling into grass. Yet no fruit was ever found, only footprints, half-formed and wandering, never paired. And at the center, the bench, now holding a notebook and a coat that no longer fit anyone. Part 8. The room that forgot why it was locked. The door had no keyhole, no lock on the outside, only a handle, brushed brass, smoothed by decades of trembling hands. It had always been closed. In the early days, when the town was still loud enough to pretend at joy, children would dare one another to knock. Most came away giggling, swearing they heard whispers. One boy, Emmett, had touched the handle and fell silent for 3 days. No one asked what he'd heard, not even his mother. It stood behind the chapel, near the foundation where an old bell tower had once leaned before it crumbled into a shape like prayer. The door was fitted into the chapel's spine like a misplaced memory, too old to be new, too smooth to be ancient. Fen approached it with a scrap of paper in his coat. On it, a name he'd nearly forgotten, a name that had no place in the registry, a name he wasn't sure was his own. He didn't knock. He placed the paper at the base of the door. The handle turned without his touch. Inside, dust, a single chair, a mirror cracked but not broken and angled away from the door. On the floor, salt. In the corner, a basin dry, hanging from a nail, a small key with no teeth. The room had no windows, and yet the air felt stirred, as if someone had just left. Fen stepped in. The door closed behind him. He did not panic. He sat on the chair, waited. In the mirror, something moved. Not a figure, not a face, but an outline of where a person should be, an echo in silhouette. It tilted as if in thought. Fen removed his coat, folded it neatly, placed it on his knees. "Why did you come?" the silhouette asked, not in voice, but in shape. He didn't answer. Instead, he held up the paper with the name. The mirror dimmed. The salt on the floor began to curl toward the center. Then slowly, Fen whispered a sentence that no longer belonged to any living language. "If a door forgets its lock, does it still wait to be opened?" The mirror did not reply, but the key fell from the nail. He picked it up, felt its smoothness. There was no lock, not in that room. But when he turned to leave, the door was gone, and in its place, a hallway that none remembered building. It stretched ahead, like a timeline rewritten, and at its end, a faint flicker, not of light, but of recognition. And so he walked. The key vanished in his hand, not melted, not dropped, just ceased. Behind him, the room forgot it had ever been locked. Ahead of him, the hallway began to hum, and behind its reflection, for the briefest moment, something flickered. A candle that had once been lit by someone he never met. Someone who never left. Part 9. The quiet ink of departure. Let the rain begin again, like a lullaby for those who forgot how to leave. The first raindrop touched the top of Amir's shoulder as though hesitant. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the mist that had hung in the clearing thickened into a fine drizzle, threading silver through the air. It wasn't the kind of rain that demanded shelter, but one that seemed to stitch the sky back together, thread by quiet thread. He did not rise immediately from where he sat beside the stone-marked yalan. The letters he had carried, those humble bundles of breath and longing, were still untouched. But something in the air shifted, as though the gate behind him had exhaled. Amir stood slowly. His robe was soaked at the hem, mud curling up the edges like old calligraphy. He looked at the stone again, and for a moment, the word carved upon it seemed to flicker, not by any light, but by something deeper. Jalan. Not just a road, a decision, a relinquishing. He walked, but this time he did not follow the path that led back to Tunas Luru. Instead, his steps curved sideways, between two old palms into a corridor of sound. The rain sang on the leaves above him, a percussion soft enough to soften his thoughts. And behind the sound, a silence waited like a second heart. He passed 3 trees marked by pieces of cloth. The first cloth was green, and it fluttered gently in the wind. Beneath it, the word Doa was carved into the trunk. Not a prayer for gain, but for release. The second cloth was white, nearly translucent with age. Its word was pulang, to return, not always to a place, but to a self. The third cloth was black. The bark beneath it bore no word, only a smear of soot where something had been burned away. He did not pause long. The terrain rose, and a shallow incline led him toward a structure he hadn't seen before. It was a small hut, barely larger than a storage room, built entirely of mismatched wood. On its roof grew moss and a single, sprouting fig tree. A man sat inside, hunched over a table, writing. Not with a brush or pen, but with the tip of his finger, tracing letters into a thin layer of ash that covered the table like paper. He did not look up. Amir entered slowly, the wooden floor creaking beneath his feet like an old cello. The man continued writing, his fingertip dragging gentle loops and curves that disappeared as quickly as they were formed. "What are you writing?" Amir asked, not sure if he had spoken aloud. The man looked up at last. His eyes were the color of almond bark, deep and dispassionate. "I am writing things no one needs to remember," the man replied. "They come here to forget." Amir sat across from him, his hands resting quietly on his knees. "Then why write at all?" he whispered. The man smiled, not kindly, but knowingly, because forgetting is also a kind of remembering. When the ink runs dry, sometimes silence finishes the line. A long pause passed between them. Then the man stood, walked to a small wooden box beside the hearth, and opened it. Inside lay a single object, a brush. Its handle was cracked, its bristles curled. But Amir recognized it, not because he had seen it before, but because it had belonged, once, to someone like him. The man handed it to Amir. "No ink, no paper," he said. "But you no longer need either." Amir held the brush, and for the first time in years, his hand did not tremble. Outside, the rain began to slow, and somewhere in the clearing, the letters wrapped in burlap unfurled on their own, as though hearing their names whispered again by a voice older than time. Part 10. One letter at the edge of dawn. For not every story ends with a silence. Some end with a single letter still breathing. The sky above the old hill was neither dark nor light. It held the soft hue of something just about to become. It was not yet dawn, and yet not quite night. A hush covered the earth, like the breath before a name is spoken aloud. Amir knelt before a slate of stone that was not a grave and not a monument, but something in between. He drew with the brush. No ink, no canvas, no audience. Only the memory of a line that had never been written and yet always existed, just waiting for the hand to stop resisting it. The shape he traced was simple. One letter, a single arc, cradling the silence beneath it. He did not know if it belonged to the alphabet he had once memorized as a boy, or if it belonged only to the language of things that are felt, not spoken. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps it always had been. Behind him, the sound of slow footsteps approached. He turned, expecting no one, and yet found Idris standing in the pale light, soaked with travel, dust, and longing. The young man's eyes were wide, not with surprise but with recognition. He did not speak. Instead, he knelt beside Amir, and then, without a word, he drew his own finger across the damp earth, mirroring the curve that Amir had made. 2 strokes, 2 voices, 2 rememberings. And in the air between them, neither heavy nor empty, a small wind stirred the edges of the world, just as the horizon broke into the first golden note of morning. The letter still lingered on the stone. But this time, it did not need to be finished. It had already become. In the villages beyond Tunas Luru, they still speak of the calligrapher who never wrote by daylight. They say, he once wrote a word so quiet, only God could read it. And some say, it was not a word at all, but a mirror for those ready to read themselves. The end. And so, the path ends, not with a gate, but with a quiet breath in the fog. A memory without borders, a road no longer drawn, but still walked, in dreams. Perhaps you have walked it too, not with your feet, but with something older, something slower, a longing carried in silence across the folds of night. Thank you for traveling with us tonight. From forgotten crossroads to dusty signposts, from whispering stones to doorways without names. At Sleepthrum, we believe stories are not just told. They are felt, and sometimes they're remembered not by the mind, but by the soul half asleep. If your eyes are still open, close them gently now.